Good evening, everyone. If everyone could just take their seats, we are going to start this evening's very special event. So I'm Alon Casuto. I'm the CEO of the Zionist Federation of Australia, and on behalf of the Zionist Federation, United Israel Appeal, Zionism Victoria, and Central Shul, it's a real honor and privilege for us to be welcoming you here tonight for what will be a very, very special conversation. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and our First Nations, just like the Jewish people, have had a continuous connection to this land and presence in this land for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that as we gather here tonight, we still have 101 of our brothers and sisters who are held captive in Gaza. It's been over 400 days that they have not seen freedom and seen their families, and we pray for their release. And of course, I want to acknowledge our brave soldiers of the IDF who stand ready to protect us and make the ultimate sacrifice so that our people can live in security. It's my honor tonight to introduce an incredibly distinguished guest in John Spencer, a name that's become synonymous with expertise in urban warfare and military strategy. As the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern Institute at West Point, John has advised senior military leaders at the highest levels, and these include the Pentagon, four-star generals, and leaders who are shaping security across the world. His insights have shaped the way that urban combat is understood and conducted across the world. John's not just a scholar and author of numerous incredibly influential works on urban warfare, but also a combat veteran himself and a leading voice on the complexities of modern conflict. His analysis of recent wars, which include the Ukraine and the war in Gaza, have been sought out globally because of their ability to offer a clear-eyed view on the realities on the ground and the profound challenges of warfare in densely populated areas. John spent significant time on the ground over the past year with the IDF in Gaza. And in the context of Israel's current conflicts with Hamas, as well as with Hezbollah, as well as the broader role of Iran in the region, John's expertise are simply invaluable. And tonight, John has the role of helping us navigate some of these complexities and shedding light on urban warfare. What does it teach us about strategy, about ethics, about the human cost of war? Some of the questions that we will cover include: what are some of the misconceptions about urban warfare, especially when it comes to Gaza? We see a lot of images, we hear a lot of stories, but what does it actually look like on the ground from those who are having to make the most difficult of decisions on a daily basis? How does Hezbollah approach urban and guerrilla warfare, and how is this different to Hamas? What does a Trump administration mean for the region and for urban warfare? These are just some of the fascinating topics that we're going to cover in tonight's conversation. We are also privileged to have John with us for a number of days in Australia, and we will be taking him with us to Canberra to have private meetings with some of the most important decision makers in the country. Moderating tonight's discussion, we are privileged to have Michael Borski, King's Counsel, who is a valued ZFA board member. He's chair of our public affairs portfolio, and he will guide the conversation as well as welcome questions from the audience. Now, I have to emphasize that questions from the audience should be brief and should be short and should end with a question mark. Our conversation tonight is being live streamed, and we've got several hundred people joining us from across Australia. So welcome to those who are joining us online. And please join me in welcoming John Spencer to this ZFA Live Conversations.
Thanks, Alon. And thank you, John, very much. We're all very, very excited, and as Alon said, privileged to have you here. This is the only public function that John's doing for the few days he's here. So those of you in the room and watching along are privileged, especially to have the opportunity to ask some questions. John's just off the plane really this morning from the East Coast. Is Is that right?
That's right.
So you're both a military expert and a very good sport. Thank you. I wanted to start just by inviting you to give us a current situational assessment, if you would, on the wars or the multi-front war, depending on how you see it, but certainly in Gaza and Lebanon. Just let us know how you see things as we stand.
Sure. And thank you from ZFA and for everybody coming and for the wonderful the host and the welcome that I received so far. It's hard to summarize what's going on because Israel is facing a 7-front war, being attacked daily from multiple directions, and each one of those have their own complexity, but also are tied together in their own ways. For me, of course, I've been studying what happened on October 7th and, of course, the war. From the beginning, when Israel declared war, which within my world means something different. Some people use war synonymously with like the war on drugs and things like that. But from an academic context, Israel declared war against Hamas after October 7th in accordance with United Nations Article 51, self-defense, set 3 goals. Those goals have not changed: bring the hostages home, destroy Hamas, remove their political and military power, and ensure that no threat comes from the Gaza Strip ever again. As we stand up right now today, Hamas is destroyed. That gets touchy with people, and academically, what does that mean? How do you destroy an ideal? How do you destroy an organization? Hamas was both the political apparatus. Israel left Gaza in 2005. Hamas in power. All institutions are Hamas. Hamas had a military comprising of 24 battalions across the geographic region of the Gaza Strip. Of those 24 battalions, there's only one that is believed to still exist. All other ones have been broken and cannot perform military functions. Of course, Hamas is still fighting back because they've received many signals of hope that they might win the war. For Israel to win the war against Hamas, Hamas can never rule in Gaza again. From a very grand strategy perspective, the only thing that Hamas has to do is survive. As we talk right now, there are 2 brigades, technically 3, but 2 brigades, one in Rafah still conducting clearing operations, of course, searching for hostages, but also Hamas military capabilities. They've sealed the border between Gaza and Egypt, which was discovered to have 100 tunnels, 100 plus tunnels, providing a superhighway of arms and money and illicit goods into Gaza for a long time. That's been sealed. They're continuing the clearing operations. And then you have another brigade in northern Gaza conducting high intensity combat, conducting evacuations of civilians who didn't leave in previous evacuations, and searching for Hamas and using different techniques that they've learned to get to the Hamas remaining in the population. You have COGAT doing massive historic levels of humanitarian aid, vaccinations, you name it, to the people in Gaza, their population. Hamas is losing, but they haven't lost the war. So this is also what does the day after look like, and that part of my work. So Israel and the IDF are creating new buffer zones between Gaza and Israel so they can repopulate the south, which a lot of focuses. We'll talk about the repopulating the north is a new strategic goal that Israel put on the war goals. But creating an environment so that the people can move into the south is still a goal, and creating the new buffer zones between Gaza, 1,000 meters or a kilometer between what used to be the wall and where the Gaza population point will be, creating new corridors, a Netzarim corridor going through Gaza, creating the Rafah, basically where the Philadelphia corridor was, so that Israel can project power into whatever comes after Hamas and helping rebuild power. Quickly in the north, in less than 2 weeks, through the pager operation and many strategic strikes, Israel and the IDF have eliminated the entire hierarchy of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was a massive military of 100,000 plus soldiers, but within 2 weeks, through the pager operation and a lot, hitting Hassan Nasrallah in the capital, have the complete hierarchy eliminated. and then moved forward with a limited ground incursion, and then grew that ground incursion to where you have multiple brigades of IDF now doing clearing operations in southern Lebanon. Challenges I'm sure we'll talk about with even the underground, vastly different, the terrain in southern Lebanon, vastly different, and Israel is losing soldiers, even as of a couple of days ago, doing a very methodical clearing of southern Lebanon to discover all the caches of Hezbollah's. So once he took out the leadership, you still have the rank and file fighting, but you still had that, what could be 200,000 rockets. Israel believes it's eliminated 80% of those rocket launchers, but you still have to methodically clear southern Lebanon of the enemy that was never supposed to be in that area south of the Litani River. And that takes a lot of time. So you have a lot of IDF soldiers going village to village, clearing house to house, looking for those supplies, and moving forward with that.
I want to ask you about the hostages. Alon mentioned, I think this is the 408th day that still 101 hostages remain in Hamas's captivity. Thankfully, almost half of the just over 250 were returned alive. But as heartbreaking and inconceivable as that is for hostages and their families, and really for the whole Jewish people, you're a military strategist. I want to respectfully put all that aside and just ask you, militarily and strategically, how does that complicate Israel's military efforts in Gaza? And what observations have you got as to how Israel's navigated that militarily, and any observations you might have on the successful rescue mission as well?
Sure. So
I'm sure we can.
Sure. So this has been really complicated to discuss because all war is politics by other means. I mean, there's always an internal with the political goals established by both sides, and in the international context. Through the use of all forms of national power, Israel has brought over half the hostages home. That's still the psychological warfare that was created in taking the hostages, and Yahya Sinwar knew what he was doing by doing that. That it creates this, no matter what you do, the psychological warfare that you could do something different. The ideal, which was a lie that continues to spread in my world, that you could have offered Hamas anything and they would have given the hostages back. It just isn't realistic on the history of Hamas taking a single hostage like Gilad Shalit and returning him 5 years later after exchanging him for 1,000 prisoners. How Israel has navigated that despite the political constraints put on them by the international community, not naming names, but like the United States and others. I stay apolitical. War is fought within the political context. So even what Israel needed to do to bring the hostages home rapidly, but also the complexity, I know that we'll talk about it, like what is it like walking the ground in Gaza and those densely populated cities, even if you empty them of most civilians. I mean, there's 24 cities in the Gaza Strip, 10 with over 100,000. There are vast areas where Israel hasn't gone yet. Even in the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, which over 1 million people moved to, Israel hasn't been in there. Israel has done lots to protect civilians, which also then technically as a strategist reduces your ability to find hostages, because hostages can be moved with civilian populations like we saw in Rafah. Don't go to Rafah, where were some of the hostages? Hostages were in Rafah. So how do you get so that some people believe that you can, just use your intelligence apparatus to find the hostages. Like if you understand the density of that population, to include the radicalization of the population, or what you could offer the population, then to give you intelligence or to get into it and use human intelligence. So the fact that Israel did do these, unbelievable hostage rescues that they've done, to include, basically like Fauda movie, setups of, buying apartments near where they believe they are and being able to do that. That's amazing. But how hard that is to do in that level of a population. Of course, you could hide 100 people, which includes 3 people that were before October 7th held by Gaza in their bodies. how hard it would be to find them in that population, that in there being vast areas where the IDF haven't even gone yet. So it creates this situation. Absolutely, it complicates everything from how do you deal with a tunnel to how do you deal with a population center that you're doing an operation if every time you're looking for hostages and trying to prevent them from being moved, and how do you discover them?
So talk to us about the tunnels. I know you've, amongst other things, studied tunnel networks around the world and through history in quite some detail. Talk to us about some of that, if you would, please, and just how this particular tunnel network compares, and some of the efforts Israel's made to identify and ultimately destroy them.
Sure. So there's no comparison to the tunnel network that Hamas built in Gaza. There's just not. I mean, there are other tunnels in other wars, and there's even tunnels in North Korea, and I've been in some of the ones between North and South Korea, and there's tunnels in China. Nothing compares to what Hamas built in Gaza. Not even Hezbollah tunnels, which are more and different, but nothing compares to what Hamas built. One, just from the sheer scale of it. So over 450 miles. I don't know my kilometers. I think it's like 500 kilometers, but I don't.
I think it's a little more than that.
Yeah, 700 kilometers maybe.
There you go.
Ranging from just below the building to over 200 feet underground, where I was walking in places like Khan Yunis or the Netherine Corridor, and every step you take, there's a tunnel underneath you. It's bigger than the London Metro. It's bigger than the Seoul Metro, bigger than the New York City Metro. They built cities underground, basically. Roughly, I estimate to be over $11 billion investment. And I was in one in December of 2023. They found 100 meters outside of Israel's border that was 2.5 miles long, going back into Gaza City. It had advanced ventilation, power, telecommunication wires, like multi-million-dollar tunnel. That makes it something different than any other military has faced. What also makes it different is that it was built as the sole center of gravity for the enemy strategy. Because I look at both sides and what they're trying to do. Hamas never, it prepared Gaza for war for 20 years, and that's very different. Especially if we want to compare what Israel has done and their metrics against any other war. Most other major urban battles, from Stalingrad to Aachen, Ortona, Fallujah, Ramadi, Echo, they're all either meeting engagements or where the enemy has had a little bit of time to prepare to fight, not 20 years of actually building the city for fighting. I used to say they put the tunnels underneath all the hospitals and the schools and the mosque, and they did that. But after being there, they built the tunnel and then put the school on top of it. That's different because no other enemy has there been a war where the underground is more important to them than the surface in a war to achieve their goal. Because Hamas's goal is not to fight, really. It's to delay the IDF till the international community stops the IDF. And they also do something that no other enemy's ever done in the history of war, which is to use those tunnels and then deploy a human sacrifice strategy. We talk about human shields a lot. And I teach a course on urban warfare to armies. And we talk about human shields, those who use the laws of war against the moral, ethical, law-abiding military like the IDF against them. So they'll hide in the hospitals and things. That's kind of normal terrorist activity. But nobody's ever acted and said and acted in a way like, I need all my civilians to die. And I hope they all die to achieve my goal. The Japanese didn't do that. The Nazis didn't do Al-Qaeda, ISIS, none of them, that's what the tunnels are built for. The tunnels are built for them to hide in the tunnels and then try to get the civilians killed to get somebody to stop the IDF. All 2.2 million of the people in Gaza could fit in those 400 miles of tunnels with ease. But not one of them is allowed in those tunnels. And then again, that's unlike anything I've ever seen. In my travels into Ukraine, the civilians seek refuge in the metros and the tunnels, everything from the rockets and from the bombing. But there's a lot of differences there. For you, tactically, how do you clear that has been a huge challenge, because that's what Hamas wanted it to be. It wanted to delay the IDF. So every tunnel, they found over 6,000 tunnel shafts. And every one of those is, you got to stop. You got to investigate it. And the Hamas would booby trap as they use the tunnels to pop up and attack, and then they would get back in. They would just they would just line the tunnels with bombs, but they didn't line them. They actually built the tunnels with bombs in the walls. So they poured the concrete and then just armed the bombs as they were leaving. That caused a big challenge for the IDF. The IDF tried to flood the tunnels, which was really innovative. Didn't work. And then they...
Why didn't it work? What was the result then?
So the flooding had historically worked along the Egypt-Gaza borders to destroy Hamas tunnels, smuggling tunnels, because the tunnels were very, porously built, and the earth would just collapse into it. Well, Hamas's tunnels are concrete lined. They're all usually the same. So they're a tunnel, they're a tube, but they're not porous. So it just seeps out the sides. Some of them are actually built with drainage in them. So one case, they filled a tunnel and it took, and these pumps that they brought in could fill a swimming pool in like 7 minutes. They're like massive pumps, but it still took 2 weeks to fill one tunnel. And it did push the Hamas out of the tunnel so they would fight, but then the water would just seep right back out. It definitely didn't destroy them. Actually, after the 2020 last war, where there was a ceasefire after the Guardian of the Walls, where Israel had used its bunker busters to destroy tunnels, Yahya Sinwar, they actually found intelligence had authorized $275,000 to put in more blast doors in the tunnels, because if you hit a tunnel with a bunker buster, the concussion will go down the tunnel and destroy some of it. So they put these more blast doors in, which actually also prevents flooding. It slows the flooding down. But what's been interesting, I almost said cool.
It's good to love your work, John.
Yeah, you can tell. What's been very interesting, as somebody who's studied underground warfare as long as I've studied urban warfare, is that Israel, through this challenge of Hamas's tunnel, has conducted a paradigm shift in underground warfare, where even the IDF had a culture of don't enter tunnels unless you have to. By the time you get to Khan Yunis, there's IDF leadership saying, I don't like this. I don't like the enemy having the advantage. So they developed a very risky way to enter the tunnels before Hamas knew that they're in the tunnels. So by February, you have IDF forces entering Hamas's tunnels and attacking on the surface at the same time. So simultaneous attack underground and on the surface to take that advantage of the tunnels away. That paid dividends, because that same techniques were being used when they entered Lebanon, getting into the tunnels before the enemy knows you there. So it's basically, those are the IDF's tunnels now. Like, thanks for building those. Now I can attack you in different ways. And that paradigm shift is historically, like, I can't find it. I mean, going back to like how David conquered Jerusalem, like sending people into the water shafts, that level of hasn't been seen in modern times.
You mentioned Lebanon. Could you just give us a little bit of detail on the differences there in the terrain and the nature of the military challenge Israel faces and how it's progressing?
Sure. So tunnels still a challenge. I mean, tunnels are what people do to protect things. So to protect rocket supplies, command and control, even to move. In southern Lebanon, it's called the land of tunnels. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of tunnels going all the way up to the Syrian border. There's like a reported 45-kilometer long tunnel. They're dug into solid rock. One of the reasons there's so many tunnels in Gaza is it's just loose sediment, and they can dig it with hand tools and literally make money. It's like an economy, and make money by digging tunnels during the day and doing something else at night, I guess. But there, the Hezbollah is actually digging into straight rock and creating bunkers, and of course, state sponsorship. But the challenge for the IDF in southern Lebanon, it's still urban, because in my world, all roads lead to urban. So there's still villages and towns that have to deal with, but the threat from anti-tank guided munitions, the size of the force, the where the tunnels are, and your ability to get to them, because just like we would, which some people discount in Gaza, and hopefully you asked me that question, like, how would any other military have done this differently, especially the United States? You can hit some tunnels underground and penetrate the earth, but in southern Lebanon, that's really hard to do because they're deeper and they're in solid rock. So what's going on there is the challenge of but there's also advantages, right? So I'm sure we'll talk about how do you move civilians out of harm's way. In southern Lebanon, evacuations happen, civilians are able to evacuate, and civilians did that. So there's a lot less civilians, but the IDF are losing a lot of soldiers, frankly, in southern Lebanon from having to do that house-to-house clearing and running into ambushes and things like that, where there's still Hezbollah fighters that are staying in those environments and doing their best to set up ambushes and to catch soldiers in different ways. But the challenge is so vast, but the goals are different. So I try to, in my talks, of course, the misinformation, people think that, southern Lebanon will look like Gaza. And just the terrain is different. The objective is different. Israel's goal in southern Lebanon is to create a new security framework in which the 80 to 100,000 Israelis who have had to be homeless for the last year can move back into their homes and safely believe that there is security. That's a different mission than destroy Hezbollah, which isn't the goal. Because destroy Hezbollah, who is integrated in the Lebanese government and the Lebanese society in Beirut, it's an unachievable goal, and it's not the goal of the war. It's to create this buffer between, whether it's the Litani River, which is an old kind of line of demarcation that the UN Security Council did, and the United Nations mandate for Lebanon, UNIFIL, which completely failed. I have my own thoughts about these organizations, but they've found some of the things they found in southern Lebanon that have missed kind of mass media, I guess, are all the plans that Hezbollah had in place to conduct an October 7th in the north, on the Galilee. So entire bunkers full of the same cameras, the same motorcycles, the same equipment to do the same level of massacre on civilians. They're finding those in deep buried bunkers. So to create this buffer, but the goal is different. And already you see Hezbollah, after they've been an unparalleled operation. Just the pager operation in itself it's just never been seen before. And I had to argue that it's legal because just from a legality stance, it was just so impressive. But you already see Hezbollah considering making an agreement to create a ceasefire because, of course, Hezbollah said they attacked for Gaza, which is just ridiculous. But you already see, because the goals are different in the north, but it's going to take a while for the IDF to clear all that ground and create this new buffer so people can not only move back and not have a rocket pointing at their house, but also have a sense of safety, which is really hard to do.
I promise I'll ask you about what you think the US would have done different and those related matters, but there's so much interesting in what you've just said that I want to pick up on a couple of points. First of all, the pager mission, which I think a lot of us are very eager to hear about, and you seem very eager to talk about. So just talk us through, not necessarily the technicalities of it, but we hear reports or accusations, I should say, that it's indiscriminate violence, and I can see you shaking your head.
Well, I mean, sometimes I try not to get surprised at the ridiculous accusations waged at the IDF, but even that one surprised me. I'm sure everybody knows, but Israel's, well, I think there might have been an actual a leader say this to them. Let's say there's plausible deniability. Somebody got into Hezbollah's supply chain system where Hezbollah believed that Israel was inside their communication, so they ordered pagers for Hezbollah. So the terrorist organization ordered new pagers for themselves.
And only for the important members, right?
Only the important members. Ordered them, went through lots of security protocols to ensure that these were very safe because they believed Israel was into their phones and into their other things. Somebody was able to intercept these, insert explosives, and then at the moment of their choosing, somebody detonated the pagers. So it's as clear a case of sabotaging enemy equipment as you can get. And this is where legality gets into like booby traps versus sabotage of military equipment. This was a piece of equipment ordered by a terrorist army for terrorist leaders that only they would be carrying. And the explosives was created so it would just detonate into the person. So all the explosions were very discriminate, and it took out, as in disabled, over 1,000 terrorists with a single click of a button. So very discriminate, very legal, very, I mean, just to be able to do it and how many chances it could have gone wrong, and how effective it was, not only in the attack. And I wrote this article, one saying it's legal, but also like it will take its place as in this historic intelligence operation on an enemy army, that not only had real physical effects, because the pager also paged everybody at once, so they would look at their pager, and a lot of them got it into their face. But it also sent shock throughout the entire army on they can't trust a single piece of their equipment, which is very important in war. War is a contest of will. That psychological element, very important. And then the next day, 24 hours later, something similar happens to their walkie-talkies. So if you're a Hezbollah, you're like, we can't do anything. We can't trust a single piece of equipment. That's priceless. So absolutely legal, discriminate. It distinguishes between combatant and non-combatant. And yes, there were things like the Iranian ambassador to so-and-so who happened to be carrying the terrorist's pager. So they might want to be asking those questions of those people. But I mean, just a historic operation followed by more historic operation. I mean, I'm an American. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Jewish. I'm pro-truth. But Israel, within those 2 weeks, took out terrorist leaders that we have been looking for 40 years, who killed American Marines in Beirut in the Beirut bombing. And Israel, they've been on our wanted list for 40 years, and Israel took them all out in this campaign to eliminate the entire hierarchy of Hezbollah in 2 weeks.
You've written that, according to your study and research, no military power in history has taken greater precautions to protect civilians and civilian casualties than Israel, despite what we all read in the paper. Can you just talk through some of the evidence for that contention you make? Sure.
So the evidence is, so my statement that gets quoted a lot, and I stand by it, and there's been nobody to come up with data to disprove me, because I've done the years of work that Israel has done more, as in implemented more measures to prevent civilian casualties than any military in the history of war. That's a fact, because I know what every military has ever done according to what battle. And I can't compare it to people like Russia, who killed 10% of the Chechen population in a matter of months trying to get to like the Battle of Grozny. I can't compare it to the Syrian military where they killed 300,000, chemically bomb all their. So I compare it against any law-abiding military faced in an urban scenario, and I could list all those for you. And what have they ever done, if anything? Because then there's an argument of, does it actually limit civilian harm by doing these things? Put that aside, as in like when we invade Afghanistan, Iraq, Panama, just about anywhere, we don't do these notifications, because getting in and dominating your enemy with extreme force, surprise, and audacity cognitively defeats them. Like when we drive a tank around the center of Baghdad, they know it's over, and then they all walked away, which they did. But if there is a contested urban battle, whether it's huge or small, the normal thing to do is wait, notify the civilian population to please get out of harm's way. And the number one way that we've done that in history, whether it's Fallujah, Mosul, others, is to drop flyers on their heads. So we just use thousands of pieces of paper that rain down from the sky and notifying them that this is a combat area, please leave. Israel did that. So Israel, after October 7th, waited 3 weeks, gave notification, and immediately the world said, you can't do that. You can't evacuate 1 million people from northern Gaza and tell them go to southern Gaza so you can attack the terrorist military that just took over 250 plus hostages back into the enemy territory. But they did the flyers. Israel also did the telephone calls, over millions of telephone calls, is more than the people in this room, IDF soldiers, calling into the enemy environment and trying to get a hold of any leader, imam, family leader, grocery store owner, call them, and tell them to please leave. This is a combat area. They sent millions of voice messages, text. They would call buildings. They have the thing called roof knocking, where they'll call a building and say, hey, this is a military building, please leave. They won't, then they'll drop stuff on the roof called roof knocking. Israel started doing daily pauses. So every day for hundreds of days, Israel would notify the entire population, for these 4 hours, we will stop all fighting so you can move along this road and to get to safety. No other military does that. No other military has done that level of daily pauses for civilians to get out of harm's way after the battle has started. Israel started handing out their maps. So their military maps that I teach militaries how to do, Israel started handing those out to the population and also the enemy, and then doing very localized evacuation. So like in the maps would say like number 201. So every day the IDF would say, okay, please, anybody who's in area of 201, please leave. And Israel started flying drones with speakers on them into those areas. No military's ever done that. Israel started doing what's called call outs, where they'll surround an area and then call everybody out. Because what was happening is that in the north, like we talked about, that all the civilians were leaving, but also Hamas and also possibly hostages. So by the time they get to February, Israel, and being criticized on the civilian casualty numbers, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that also historic. Nobody's ever reported daily how many civilians are dying, because it's not possible. In all other urban battles,
It may be that still nobody is reporting with any accuracy or
Correct.
integrity how many
Correct.
civilians are
Yeah.
actually dying.
in all these other battles, it was years later that they would come up with a number, not in the battle. It's actually a very common terrorist tactic to say this many people are dying a day, but it's never been this where the world.
The terrorist tactic being to try to convince your enemy that a lot of them are dying.
No, like the first Battle of Fallujah was a mini Gaza. In the first Battle of Fallujah, 4 American contractors were killed. The 2 Marine battalions were ordered into the city to get those responsible. Al Jazeera was sitting at the city hospital airing photos of children and then coming up with false numbers of hundreds of civilians dying.
Right.
So it was like a mini Gaza, but that's been happening every day since October 7th in Gaza.
And it feels, I think, to many of us in this room, that those claims in this war are getting very extensive reporting and focus on the international arena. Is that your impression too, as an objective person, a scholar of military history and not a Jew? Is that your impression too, that Israel, the civilian casualties that Israel's accused of causing is getting disproportionate attention?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been, for some reason, the overwhelming bit of information. It's not evidence, because it's a lie, and I can break that down if you'd like.
Well, why do you say it's a lie? Just because it's impossible to know?
It's impossible to know, and I know what's on the list. So this is where I usually break down the 40. So as of today, the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry, because there wasn't a ministry of anything in Gaza since 2008, unless it's Hamas. The Hamas Gaza Health Ministry, as of today, says there's 43,000 people who have been killed, which is a lie. And the media will say that Israel has killed, which is also a lie. It's just all lies.
So just breaking that down,
Yep.
You say it's a lie that Israel's killed them all, because
Yep.
presumably you say some of them are the victims of Hamas misfires and other things.
Yeah, of the over 15,000 rockets that Hamas has launched at Israel since October 7th, every one of them a war crime, because it cannot distinguish where they're going. 20% of those have landed inside Gaza and killed Gazan citizens.
And why are you so confident that the number is a lie?
Yeah. One is because the list, knowing what's on, what the number, how the number is generated. So most people most reporters don't even know, and especially a political leader, they just keep parroting what the terrorists say, which is unique. But if you took the number, some people have done this, taken every name and then looked at every name on the list. The name includes anybody who has died for any reason since October 7th. So if you're a Palestinian civilian who crossed into Israel on October 7th to rape, murder, do all these things and died, you're on the list. You're on the list if a civilian, so a big portion of the list is actually from what's called the Google Docs of report your martyr here. So within Gaza, you can go on a Google Doc and report somebody missing, and that goes on the list. So they're a part of the 43,000. I mean, there's also people on the list who died years ago. There are people that don't exist. There are, what people believe it is actual bodies, and it's not. Then there's what's missing, which again, so not only from the Google Doc, report your martyr here, but the list also includes people they see on credible media reports as missing. So somebody within this Gaza Health Ministry magical system finds out that somebody's missing, and they add them to the list. So this is knowing what's on the list, how the list is generated. The list is sometimes incomplete. I just reported again today, there's this lie that 70% of the people that have died in Gaza are women and children. Like there could be no bigger lie than that.
And why do you say that?
Because go by the name list, and that's not what it shows. And then I won't even get into the fact that according to, I guess, the United Nations, 18 and below is a child. I joined the military at 17. So then there's the idea that no woman could not be a combatant. Like that's a myth. Like I've faced women who are combatant in war. It's just the number, actually, the 70% came from a report where they analyzed 8,000 of the names they could verify. And they just took 8,000 from this magical list and then said, okay, of this list, we're saying 70% are women and children. So that becomes in the media, all the deaths. Like, that's just crazy. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. That would be like, and also the combatant, right? So this is I don't like getting in the combatant, non-combatant ratio. There's never been a war in the history of war that I know of, and I'm pretty sure, because I study war for a living, where any nation's been asked, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? Because that's not how war works. It's just not how the law of war works. That's an Israeli question. And I'm really concerned that it will be asked of other armies later. And some people say, well, this is just an Israeli standard that we're asking Israel.
You're concerned that this could create a new standard to the detriment of the US and other law-abiding.
Any law-abiding military, which is a really big, because I've been fighting the United Nations for years, and this is why I was so prepared to that's bull. Like, I know where that lie came from. Like this idea you can't use 2,000-pound bombs in urban areas. Like, I know where that comes from because I've been fighting it. Because, or you can't touch a hospital. These things are there's this other body of people with power that are human rights activists. Some of them are good intention. They just don't want any war. And then there's some who are devious or anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, who use the law and then try to convince people what the law actually says versus what it actually says, what it's meant to do. I'm concerned we get to this common law that is driving war. I mean, why did Hamas, every hospital in Gaza was a Hamas headquarters, every one of them. They haven't found one that doesn't have Hamas in it, because the way that law and the way it looks, that a hospital is being attacked. Although Israel didn't attack hospitals. We attacked hospitals in like the Battle of Mosul, the Battle of Fallujah, and we even dropped some with bombs, which Israel couldn't just publicly do. Even though if the enemy takes it, it's no longer a protected building. I'm concerned that all these new rules that people are talking about to include that question. There's never been a war where in the middle of the battle, you can know what the civilian to combatant ratio is. The rules are that you assess what the civilian casualties, and you do a proportionality assessment, which again, people lost their mind of what proportionality means, where they start saying, well, Hamas only killed 1,200 on October 7th, only in the way that I guess the way they did it doesn't matter, but they only killed 1,200, but you've killed this many in Gaza.
So proportionality, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, is about using military force proportionate to your legitimate military aim, not a commensurate number of casualties on both sides.
Correct. And the definition is very descriptive. And actually, this is where people ask me all the time, do we need new laws of war or anything like that? No, I need the world to understand what the law says. Proportionality says, like you said, that it's proportionate force to the concrete military objective you're trying to achieve, and everything feasible and reasonable, once you know what the collateral damage is, to reduce it. So feasible and reasonable to reduce civilian harms. Like, what have you done to prevent civilian harm? It isn't zero civilian harm. And each operation or strike, you assess the value of the target. So yes, if there's a a military commander who has surrounded himself with civilians, the law doesn't say you can't touch them. The law says you have to do an assessment. Okay, what's the value to your military operation? Concrete value. And then what have you done to get the civilians out of the way? Like this long list, I didn't even finish, by the way, of what Israel's done to protect civilians or get them out of harm's way. But this is where it gets really problematic, to where you build a belief that civilians, that the enemy will use that against you because we're moral, ethical forces. Well, I'll just create a scenario where you can't get to me unless you kill a certain number of civilians, and that's beyond this number that you have in your mind is too much.
I'm sorry I didn't let you finish
That's
the
all
list
right.
of humanitarian measures. But I'm proud that you couldn't even in that time finish
Yeah.
the list of humanitarian measures Israel takes. I'm conscious that we do want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. I'm just going to ask you one last one, and then we'll open
Sure.
it up to Q&A. And that is about Iran.
Yeah.
If you would just share some observations about Iran, some of the recent strikes by Israel, and what you see as the possible feasibility of Israel, with or without the United States participation, striking the nuclear program.
Yeah. So this is, of course, the head of the snake, the head of the octopus, whatever acronym you want to say, the ring of fire that's been built around Israel with Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Shia-backed groups in Iran. It's all the design of Iran. If you don't deal with that, then this just continues. Although I argue very strongly Israel is safer today than it was on October 6th. And it'll be safer for a very long time because these proxy armies that were on its borders, the paradigm is completely different. It will never go back to the way it was. But if you have the Islamic regime in Iran who says they want a nuclear weapon to destroy Israel, they have a countdown clock in their downtown central is the countdown clock of 2040 when they will destroy Israel. And that's the only reason they want this nuclear weapon. Most people would, openly say, of course, we don't want them to get a nuclear weapon. But everything that we were doing, some people, was giving Iran billions of dollars, which it then built these terror armies. Doesn't matter what their religions are. But Iran did something in April that should have, within what I call what we all call the global international order, should have changed everything. Iran directly attacked Israel with over 300 drones, cruise, and ballistic missiles. That's not proxy warfare. Like what it's done and what it's built with these terror armies, that's proxy warfare, plausible deniability. Like I don't know how they got all those weapons. But when it directly attacked, there should have been severe consequences. But I was talking on the way here, within this three-dimensional chess that we call strategy, and if there's a test of the order, and that's what Iran kept doing. It's testing the order, as in, if I attack you, what do I think you'll do to me? Or what do I think your allies will do to me? Because that's deterrence, and that's what really keeps peace. Strength through, peace. Peace through strength. Deterrence. Iran tested it in April. Because of all the international context, U.S. elections, all these things, Israel was told to take a measured response, count it as a win. They didn't hit you. And then Iran did it again. And in October, Iran attacked again with a historic level of cruise missiles, which you can't prepare for because they get there faster. And then Israel was probably told constrained strike on what it could and couldn't hit. As Israel has to balance, I think people within my world forget this. And okay, how do you get the hostages back? What do you do about Hamas? Well, that one question holds for Israel, a nation who has a responsibility for its national survival, has to balance Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, has to balance all these strategic relationships. Okay, what can we do here? But Iran attacked again in April. Israel demonstrated that Iran's complete air defense system is a joke, that you shouldn't buy things from Russia. And now there's possibility that they hit a couple other things. But it really comes down to how much does the Islamic regime in Iran think it can reach to the line without actually being a force going back to it. So this is where I'm a realist, is what I really am. Like, if you want the cycle of violence to stop, yes, you have to deal with every tentacle, but if you don't deal with the head of the octopus, then the cycle of violence is pushed back many years now, but it'll just continue because their stated goal, is a nuclear weapon to destroy Israel and then the United States. They call Israel the little Satan. They call us the big Satan.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, one or three. Okay. Philip.
Thank you, John. Wonderful address. We're talking about buffer zones in southern Lebanon, but the range of these cruise ballistic missiles has increased enormously over the last number of years. So does the buffer zone work anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Sorry, John, just before you answer, I'm just going to repeat it because for those online, they can't
okay.
hear without a microphone. So it's a question about the buffer zone, and the question is really whether buffer zones still work with cruise missiles.
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe it does. So he's talking about the pushing Hezbollah and where Hezbollah was never supposed to be. Matter of fact, all of our taxpayer money was going to this force called UNIFIL, over 18,000 troops who are supposed to be within this buffer zone, keeping Hezbollah out of the area below the Litani River. That was generated because of the range of certain capabilities at that time. Now they can hit Israel from way farther away. I still believe that it is necessary because it's talking about ground forces as well as in what has been discovered, rightfully so, by Israel, is that massive amounts of ground forces prepared to cross the border at go. But you're right that the geographic location in the buffer zone for rockets, it's more about establishing the deterrence. We, as in the international community, Israel, everybody, allowed for this rocket diplomacy to begin. Once Israel, active defense, peace through active defense. So Israel developed historic technologies to knock rockets down, which then meant that the world would expect Israel to take a bunch of rockets. And it created this diplomacy like, well, but they only launched 100 rockets at you and you shot them all down with the Iron Dome, David's Sling, whatever. So you're okay. Like, it's not a threat. Like, no, it's still a threat. And I think this is what happens in the last month or so with Hezbollah, is that you've reestablished that it isn't ping pong anymore. It isn't 100 missiles from Hezbollah and Israel would hit a couple sites of their military. You send anything this way and you will get a rain of fire the other way. And that's what the buffer zone will create. I do believe in actual buffer zones if they're actual buffer zones. So they call them DMZs, because I've been to the North and South Korea DMZ. It works. And it's been very effective. But what was supposed to be created in southern Lebanon was a buffer zone that the United Nations allowed not to be a buffer zone. And they found massive Hezbollah forces, positions, weapons, everything, 200 meters outside of UNIFIL bases in southern Lebanon. Yes, I do think so.
Yeah, right at the back. So for those online, the question is about whether there's anyone in the US government, I think, who might take responsibility for funds having gone to arm Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, no. So I won't just say no, because that's not going to happen, just because of the political aspect of it. But I personally don't want to look back. I want to look forward. So I want leaders, United States and others, I'll put Australia in the bucket.
Thank you.
That never again, in the sense of never again will we believe in organizations like UNRWA or those even aid groups to be independent, objective organizations. UNRWA needs to be dismantled and done. Independent, objective organizations. UNRWA needs to be dismantled and done away completely. Israel has taken into its own hands its security, like the border with Egypt. what Israel did with cutting off those highways going into Hamas will change everything. As a matter of fact, no military that I can think of has actually been able to do that. We weren't able to do it. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it. There were still always porous borders where the enemy could bring in new fighters, new supplies, new weapons. From Ho Chi Minh Trail to what I faced in Iranian forces in Iraq, they were just flowing in. And Israel's created a new paradigm, and I don't think it'll ever let that happen again. And even Egypt, that doesn't want it, is asking Israel, can you please put in one of those underground fences that you have on your side that actually worked? And that's what's going to happen. So, but no, nobody's going to go back and say we made a mistake. And I don't mind that. I just want them to stop doubling down on UNRWA is a good organization and we need to keep it funded. No.
Gary. So even if it might be clear that militarily Israel's defeated Hamas and on the brink of defeating Hezbollah, how does one defeat an ideology? Can one? And how's Israel going in that regard?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I did an article for Foreign Affairs, which this week there'll be a counter argument and then my counter argument. It's real academic stuff. About how do you destroy an ideology? Is Israel winning against Hamas? Could they take polls of like the population and the population supports? Like some of this is easy and some of it's not. So of course, Israel is winning at destroying Hamas's military capabilities. It hasn't won. It will take years. Even if we talk about how to destroy the tunnels.
I thought you told us they're destroyed.
Destroyed means you can't reconstitute itself. So destroyed is in their ability to do military operations today, but destroyed means not able to reconstitute themselves. So if the Israeli people say, we're done with Gaza and just leave, and that is what you call when the insurgent, which you might be able to call Hamas now, says, you have the watches, I have the time, and they just wait out like the Taliban did for us in Afghanistan. But how do you kill an ideology is actually pretty straightforward. After the 1945 battle against the Nazis, General Eisenhower, front page of newspaper says it'll take 50 years to re-educate the German people. And nobody batted an eye because we knew that. And he actually said, if you ever think I'll give Germany the ability to wage war again, you're crazy. There is a complete field of study in post-conflict studies on how to de-radicalize a population. That's how you kill an ideology. An ideology may survive, just like there are Nazis and there's Al-Qaeda and there's ISIS. They don't have governments. They don't control land. They don't have armies. You can prevent that. But you do have to begin the de-radicalization. And that goes back to the UNRWA part. Why you have to dismantle them is you have to stop the radicalization. You also have to find a new power that has the ability to manage the de-radicalization of a population, which is where you start to not kill an ideal, but create a new ideal. That doesn't happen, though, where I'll strongly disagree with people who have disagree with my assessment of Hamas, that you've just radicalized more than you've killed. I'm like, no, they're pretty radicalized before this. And if that's the mentality of war, that would be like saying, like, well, you can't kill the Nazi army because it'll radicalize the German people towards the national ideology. Like, that's just crazy. If you would have polled the Japanese people in World War II, you would have had 100% support for the emperor. They believed he was a god. That has nothing to do with winning a war. It has to do with what you do afterwards and how you de-radicalize a population. So how do you kill an ideology? First is to defeat the enemy and take the guns. If Hamas has the guns, it will be impossible to defeat the ideology.
Yes. So it's a question from someone who says they're not Jewish, but is wondering why the mainstream media is so quick to condemn Israel.
That's a long list. It's a weird Venn diagram, actually, and I've tried to explain this to people. The, the world has forgotten what war looks like, but the world has never had the ability to see into a war like this before. In war studies, we called it the Cronkite effect first, when an American journalist went into Vietnam, saw the war firsthand, came back, most trusted American journalist, told the American population, we can never win. And that's when the war was over. You lost a war strategically. Then you had TikTok wars, and you had CNN effect, where a CNN reporter would be out there, where now Hamas didn't even know this would work so well, that everybody gets an algorithm-driven view into war. They get that photo of the child being harmed fed to them. And historically, children being harmed, innocents being harmed, is very emotional, evoking. It supersedes ration, it supersedes anything that I tell you. Israel's had to fight a war where everybody can watch it on TikTok and algorithm driven. That in of itself. But then you have to talk about the myth of the who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor, the whole myth about apartheid, a blockade, Palestinian cause, all of that, forgetting what war looks like. So the numbers I didn't provide you on one example. There's only one example and this is when I interviewed the prime minister, that I gave him, and even nobody in Israel knew.
Sorry, the Israeli prime minister?
Yeah, when I interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu, I told him about the 1945 Battle of Manila. So after the U.S. military was defeated in the Philippines, we regained power. We went back to the Philippines. But in the city of Manila, there were 3,000 to 4,000 American and British prisoners of war, but also civilians called internees, men, women, and children, that we had left behind, and the Japanese were starving, torturing, everything. We hit the beaches, and General MacArthur said, go to Manila and free our people. But no air power. I don't want you to bomb the city at all. He loved Manila. His dad served there. He served there. So there were 17,000 Japanese defenders, fanatical Japanese defenders, who had a few weeks to prepare the city to fight. The city of Manila was a city of 1 million. We attacked with around 27,000 American and Philippine military with no air power. 100,000 civilians died taking that city. Nobody batted. That's a ridiculous civilian to combatant ratio. And what the number is also is that the Japanese were killing a lot of those civilians, because the Japanese were just slaughtering the civilians. But we got that's the only one that is, because it had tunnels, it had hostages, it had civilian shields, it had everything. But 100,000 civilians died in that battle, despite what the Americans tried to do to prevent destroying this. And most of the city was destroyed. People have forgotten what war looks like. And then you have all these groups also who are telling the world that Israel is doing things illegal, when it's so crazy, and it sticks. So that's why the numbers, they stick. There's some psychology to this. The algorithm driven images it doesn't matter what I say. Like, no, I see it with my own eyes, John. I see these fields of rubble. Yeah, but that's what every battle, we have a contested fight where the defender is buried into the terrain. Like, well, I don't care. Look at the images. Look at the number. 70% women and children dead. Well, that's not true. I don't care.
I think we could listen to you all evening, but unfortunately that wouldn't be right given your schedule.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. It's hard to believe that you just arrived in Australia this morning and you are just so on point. Yeah, I was going to say fresh. You have captivated the audience with your expert knowledge of urban warfare. There's so much that we can take from your discussions today, the unique challenges and complexities of urban warfare. In Gaza, how Hamas deliberately puts themselves amongst the civilian population, strategically to take advantage of Israel's commitment to comply with the laws of armed conflict. And despite the lengths and that Israel goes to comply with these laws, Israel is held to a standard that doesn't exist. John, you consistently call out this double standard. And at a time when many stay silent, knowing the truth, you stand up and say it. So thank you. I think it's the line today that you used, your pro-truth, so that's going to resonate with everyone. Michael, thank you for facilitating such an insightful discussion today, and for Central Shul for providing this space to hold this discussion. A big shout out to the ZFA team for bringing today together. This now concludes the conversation with John Spencer. On behalf of the Zionist Federation of Australia, Zionism Victoria and UIA, thank you all for coming and enjoy your evening.